good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Firoz Lalji Institute panel on the crisis in Ethiopia, with a special focus on Tigray. My name is Alex Deval. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, and I will be moderating today's discussion. The Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa is located at the London School of Economics. And today we have 5 speakers' presentations. We're going to start with a recorded presentation from Mekelle in Tigray by Mulugeta Gebrehiwot Berhe. Mulugeta was the founding director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University, also the founder of the Tana Forum. He then came here to the World Peace Foundation, where he was a senior fellow for a while, and he has been in Tigray during the war. And he has, unfortunately can't join us live, but he has recorded some remarks. We'll then go to the live speakers. We have Dr. Safia Aidid, who is an interdisciplinary historian of modern Africa and an arts and science postdoctoral fellow at the Department of History at the University of Toronto. For more details on her biography, you can refer to what has been published on the site. So I will keep these introductions brief. Then we turn to Emabet Ketacho Abate, who is an expert on peace and security and peace building in the Horn of Africa, with a wide experience working with the Life and Peace Institute and a number of different organizations, interstate organizations like the AU, NGOs, and so on. Fourth, we have Dr. Mabrato Kalecha, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the LSE, at the Firoz Lalji Institute. He has a PhD in politics from the University of Westminster and has various other academic qualifications that I won't list right now. And then lastly, Gautam Gebrel-Dwale, who is a political scientist who studies the comparative and international politics of the Horn of Africa, with thematic research interests looking at alliance politics, strategic rivalries, and nationalism. So a very rich and well-informed panel. It's very good to have a discussion on Ethiopia, which is among Ethiopians, and drawing upon their deep expertise and intimate knowledge of what is going on. Let me, and so each of those will have 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will have an open discussion. If you have questions, we will have a Q&A session. Please put your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Don't put it in the chat box. And then then those questions will be brought to the speakers, and I will be doing that. So let me just start with a few introductory remarks at this very turbulent and decisive moment in world history, where just recently an autocrat declared what he called a limited enforcement operation, not, he insists, a war, to reverse what he called the historic error of 1991, whereby historically linked peoples were able to break free, where one particular historically linked people was able to break free from its motherland. And that autocrat's goal is to reestablish a unified imperial state using overwhelming military force and including starvation, all the while blaming a Western conspiracy for the problem. Of course, I'm talking about Russia and Ukraine, but many of those exact same characterizations could be applied to the war between the federal government in Addis Ababa and the regional government in Tigray. Now, this event was planned a few months ago, at a time when the military advance of the Tigray Defense Forces appeared unstoppable. Foreign embassies had ordered the evacuation of their citizens from Addis Ababa. And Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who was at that time promising a miraculous turnaround on the battlefield, and that appeared to be based on faith alone. And 3 months on, the situation appears, I would emphasize, to be transformed, because Abiy is quite clearly in charge. He has not been overthrown. But under the surface, the crisis has not been resolved at all. In many respects, it's only shifted its shape. the Tigray Defense Forces withdrew to Tigray, though there's a lot of debate as to whether this was because of reverses at the front line, especially the massive deployment of drones, or in response to the entreaties of Western governments that indicated that if the Tigrayans were to withdraw, in return, the federal government would be pressured to engage in a peace process. But there is no visible peace process, though military action is at the moment reduced, and Prime Minister Abiy is dropping hints about the peace process. And meanwhile, fissures within the federal government are now out in the open, notably between the Oromo and the Amhara blocs within the ruling Prosperity Party. And there's turmoil in many parts of the country. There's collapsing state institutions. The security sector, once centralized professional, is becoming an arena of ethnic militia. There's a huge economic crisis, a nationwide food crisis, galloping inflation, collapse of foreign direct investment, a decline in aid, which surely, sadly, will only worsen over the coming months. And there's the under-acknowledged issue of Eritrea, whose president often appears to be calling the shots in Ethiopia as well. And yesterday, Eritrea was only one of 4 countries globally that supported Russia over the invasion of Ukraine at the UN General Assembly. Abiy's government is putting a lot of store in what it calls a national dialogue, but there's a lot of skepticism about this. And the question of whether Ethiopia has a future as a capable functioning state is not actually resolved. So in this event, we're going to address some of these immediate pressing issues in Ethiopia and also look into the deeper issues like the issue of ethnic federalism and the nationalities question that so dominates political discourse, the question of whether Ethiopia, as still grappling with its history as an imperial state, the question of the political economy, what happened to the developmental state? Are we entering what I would call a political marketplace? The humanitarian crisis, the siege of Tigray, and escalating food insecurity, the question of human rights and justice in lived experience, in law and in rhetoric, and how Ethiopia is positioning itself internationally. So I will turn to the panelists, but first of all, let us begin with the recorded statement from Tigray from Mulugeta Kebrehiyot.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mulugeta Kebrehiyot and greetings from Maqale, Tigray. I am grateful to the organizers of the Tigray event for organizing it and also inviting me to the panel. Indeed, the Tigray case deserves such an attention, among other things. The concept note for the panel gave me a wide latitude in choosing my talking points, and I opted to talk on some points on the narrative of the war in Tigray and the lessons the Tigrayans should take from it. I thank the organizers again for giving me the chance and the audience for listening to my talks in advance. I begin my talk with trying to answer on how and why did we arrive here as Tigrayans. The war in Tigray has tested the very existence of its people. We Tigrayans have faced a campaign of extermination through massacre, expansion, rape, and starvation. Many have perished, many more are suffering, and we all are traumatized. As a people, our existence is still at stake. Some parts of Tigray are still under the occupation of foreign forces and their Ethiopian allies. Any land and air transportation to Tigray and out of Tigray is closed. Tigray is completely cut off the national electric grid system, and there is no telephone and internet connection in Tigray. Shortage of food and medicine is killing thousands every week, as the Ethiopian government and its Eritrean ally have successfully blockaded any passage for humanitarian aid. The whole world is watching the genocide in Tigray, with little effort to stop it. It was visible for us, Tigrayans, the development of a hostile attitude against us following the ascent of Abiy Ahmed to power. Abiy's massive and coordinated media campaign against Tigrayans in a year's time already began to bear fruits by evicting tens of thousands of Tigrayans from all corners of Ethiopia, ransacking their property. The road connecting Tigray to the center of the country via the Amhara region was blocked for over a year, leading to the beginning of the war. Abiy Ahmed's rapprochement to Eritrea was already clear that it had hostile anti-Tigrayan motivations. Hostilities from Asmara to Tigray continued while senior security officers of both countries frequented back and forth travels to both capitals, along with frequent joint visits to Bahadar and Gondar for undisclosed purposes. The ruling elites of Tigray knew that some sort of military confrontation was coming, but they never thought that this would be in the scale they faced. The time they learned about the full preparation and plan of the intended military attack was too late for them to prepare for it. It was obvious that a long and devastating war was coming, and the rulers of Tigray were only reacting to developments rather than engaging for a longer preparation. For example, few weeks to the offensive, the ENDF decided to dissect the Northern Command into two commands for effective coordination of the attack with the Eritreans. It also decided to replace the leadership of the Northern Command by officers familiar to the plan for the Tigray war. The regional government had to stop them, citing the violations of the procedures of the army for such bigger decisions after learning of the details of the plan for the attack. A week to the start of the war, Tigray learned that most of the army of the Southern Command began mobilizing to directions of Southern Tigray via the Amhara region, and most of the forces of the Eastern Command began mobilizing to the eastern side of Tigray via the Afar region. In a similar tone, the Eritrean Defense Forces called on its reservists, their units, and massively mobilized its army divisions to the borders of Eritrea to Tigray, waiting for the hour for the attack to begin. Tigray decided for a preemptive operation on the Northern Command, a day before the beginning of the concerted military campaign. The actions on Northern Command was a mixture of political and military actions. Several officers, knowing the plot against Tigray and considering the acts of the federal government as treason on national interest, automatically changed sides without fighting and convinced several army units to simply cooperate with the government of Tigray. Some who were part of the covert planning resisted surrender and decided to fight, thus calling for limited military action. The action on the Northern Command, over and above weakening the capacity of the regime, particularly its mechanized capacity, helped delay the speed and immediate impact of the planned military attack. Furthermore, it enabled Tigray to have access to arms, which had a serious impact on the amount of casualties it inflicted on the force of aggression. Despite this, however, the Tigrayans were overwhelmed by the joint campaign of the coalition of forces that were mobilized at their full capacity. The whole army of the ENDF was mobilized to the war. The Amhara regional state mobilized its special force, police force, that was over 20,000 strong to the war, along with an assortment of special forces and militias from the other regional states of Ethiopia. 38 of the 45 divisions of the Eritrean Defense Forces mobilized to the war in the first weeks and later mobilized in full to the war. Most devastating was the deployment of the armored unmanned aerial vehicles or drones of the United Arab Emirates alongside the Ethiopian Air Force, targeting command control and firepower of the TDF with reasonably effective results. This development forces the TDF to focus on protecting its core force and work towards a full preparation for a full war. The peasants of Tigray, who observed the intent of the military campaign as manifested in its indiscriminate attacks on civilian lives and properties, began positively responding to the calls of their government for mobilization. They knew that the threat was an existential one. The force of aggression took their produce and their animals and burned and killed whatever they couldn't. The joint forces ransacked whatever public and private social and economic infrastructure and dismantled their food security system. They raped their mothers, wives, and daughters, often in front of them and accompanied by humiliating insults. In response to these actions, the whole people of Tigray turned every corner of Tigray into a point of resistance. TDF, in a very short period of time, built an army, rebooted its armed struggle military strategies and tactics, and defeated its enemies and liberated most of Tigray in one of the most astounding feats of arms in history. In a matter of 8 months, the ENDF lost most of its divisions and armament to the TDF, and left the capital of Tigray, Mekelle, in a hasty retreat. The TDF followed and crushed most of them, the remaining in the Amhara and Afar areas proximate to the Tigray region. The ENDF lost the war in June. Rather than recognizing the iron logic of the battlefield and seeking to negotiate, Abiy chose to fight on. With or without any external support, we are sure that this atrocious war will be left behind, like all other similar wars. But the war thus far has left the Tigrayans with huge lessons. Their survival will, number one, their survival will only come out of their struggle and resistance, and will absolutely owe nothing to the international community, as it all collectively and individually failed to stop the genocidal war in Tigray. Two, until all of them, including the UN Security Council and the EU Peace and Security Council, begin to reckon with their moral failures over Tigray, they will have little leverage over what the Tigrayan people decide to do. There is a chance for these international organizations to begin reckoning with themselves by forcing the government to immediately open access for humanitarian operations and the resumption of essential services. These are not issues for negotiation, as they are simply crimes against humanity. The international community can also do enough to the removal of Eritrean forces from Tigray and the return of the borders of Tigray as they existed prior to the outbreak of the war. Tigray will want to negotiate for a comprehensive ceasefire and a final political settlement. Its experience has now shown it that it should have a referendum under which its final status as an independent state or as a member of the Ethiopian Federation is to be determined. Up until the modalities and institutions for such an internationally recognized referendum is in place, it will look into a transitional government arrangement whereby it is allowed to retain its security forces up until the political fate of Tigray is determined by a referendum, whereby all forms of crimes are investigated by an independent body and justice to be served to the victims and the perpetrators to be tried in an internationally accepted standard, whereby Tigray is allowed access for international assistance, access in a direct way. But the situation also poses some long-term lessons for Tigray following the developments it led to the war. Whether as an independent state or as an integral part of Ethiopia, Tigray from now on wants to see a democracy with the following qualities. It wants to build independent state institutions and wants to end the current fusion of the ruling party with the state that has denied the autonomy of the state. It wants a political opening whereby freedom of expression and organization is fully practiced and the necessary institutions for such a practice are in place. It wants its governance system to depart from a culture of wartime leadership that did cost it a lot thus far. On the international front, the Tigrayans should prepare to work for genuine multilateralism, which is a weapon of the weak. In the advent of a multipolar world, the Tigrayans should be considering for a new non-allied movement fighting for genuine multilateralism along with other nations. This brings me to the end of my talk. The war in Tigray should ensure or the world is going to witness massive atrocities in unever witnessed levels as a result of the bloody war and the man-made famine. The Tigrayans at this particular time, while prioritizing all their efforts to end the war, should also begin thinking of taking lessons and preparing for the future. If they fail to do this, they will face the end of the war unprepared and might fail to bring a lasting solution to their problems. I thank you for your attention again.
So that was Mulugeta speaking from Mekelle, and of course one of the great absences that we've had over the last 16 months is the ability to bring people from Tigray into these conversations direct and live. And until it's possible to do that on consistently and at scale, while voices such as Mulugeta's are excluded from the ability to have dialogue and debate, we are going to not be able to make sufficient progress towards solutions. So let me turn to the panelists that are here live, and let me ask Safia to give a few remarks to open this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you to all of the organizers for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. And just wanted to say how glad I was right now to see a participant in Tigray offer his remarks as well. I think he did such a great job of just mapping out the contemporary and many of the recent events in this conflict. So I'm going to take a bit of a step back and think, given my training, to look at this historically. And I want to also bring this, and to think about how just this week, I mean, March 1st was the anniversary of the Battle of Adwa, 126 years ago. Of course, the historical victory of Ethiopian forces under Menelik II over invading Italians. And of course, this was the famous event that allowed Ethiopia to evade colonial conquest at a moment where the rest of the region fell to European colonialism. And I like to think about Adwa as a paradoxical moment, and one in which, its echoes really live with us in the present. So the paradox, of course, here is, on one hand, you have Ethiopia in this moment, 1896, affirming, in the sense of state sovereignty, its freedom, its independence in the world as a state. But on the other hand, this is a moment where Ethiopia expands as a state. It comes to conquer, actually double itself in size to the contemporary shape, Ethiopia as we know it on the map. And, we see the fall of many independent peoples and polities to the very same army. So you kind of see a duality to this event. On one hand, it's the event that allows Ethiopia to remain free, but it's also the event that enables the unfreedom of many of Ethiopia's people, many people who then became Ethiopians at that moment. So, I'd like to think, and the question that I want to ask is, what does it mean, in this very moment in which Ethiopian political modernity is forged, the Ethiopian state is born out of this moment of Adwa, when it's so fraught and so contentious, when it led to over a century of domination and enduring marginalization for millions of people who are now Ethiopians. And I've been thinking a lot about Adwa in this current conflict, not least of which because Adwa is in Tigray. But the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, despite being from the historically marginalized Oromo ethnic group, styles himself in ways that resemble more, the Shoan emperors like Menelik, like Haile Selassie, and like them aspires to monopolize state power, to centralize statehood, rather than the type of state that emerged out of the 1991 consensus, the EPRDF's form of ethnic federalism, which itself was a way of trying to grapple with the problem of nationality, something that Ethiopian scholars and Ethiopian thinkers and activists have long asked themselves, how do we deal with this state in which we have a diversity, a multiplicity of peoples, of nationalities? How do we create a state that allows for sovereignty to reside, and this is the language, of course, of the Constitution, to reside in the peoples, nations, and nationalities of Ethiopia? And of course, the answer to that, then to this TPLF-led coalition, was ethnic federalism. And of course, we're going to talk more about some of the challenges and questions of that. But you have essentially a prime minister who in many ways styles himself as an emperor. And Abiy made these parallels explicit, a number of times, referring to his military, referring to himself as the children of Adwa. And this is language that he's used explicitly. Again, Adwa is in Tigray. Its children were besieged by his armies, by Eritrean armies, militias from neighboring regions. And then you would also see, of course, some of these militia groups having badges on their arms that read Operation Menelik. So these historical parallels were brought into the conflict as well. And it's quite interesting to also think about how history itself is being deployed in this conflict in quite problematic ways. And the language, of course, has become much more intensified and entrenched. And of course, the language of Ethiopian sovereignty itself, which is something that emerges out of that 1896 moment, the defense of Ethiopia's territorial sovereignty, language that's been used regularly to crush domestic insurgencies and domestic groups, often from the marginalized populations. So, I want to say that much of Ethiopia's contemporary politics and political challenges are rooted in this history of domination, this history and historical grievances. Of course, every group has its own grievances, its own experiences. And so for us to achieve a lasting peace, it requires not only a national dialogue that addresses contemporary problems, but also thinks through many of these grievances that have long been unaddressed. That is the only way, to have a point of common understanding, of recognition, because I think so many of Ethiopia's groups only ask for that, is recognition. And there's very little indication in the present that the government's interested in achieving a sense of enduring peace. I agree with Mulugeta that, of course, in order for enduring peace to happen, this must include the cessation of hostilities. It's hard to have a national dialogue when so much of the country is engulfed in violence on many different fronts, and other areas really just simmering under the surface, a powder keg across the country. And of course, the cessation of hostilities would require negotiated settlement, an agreement, a ceasefire with all armed actors and the government. Unimpeded humanitarian access is critical. You cannot have a conversation when so much of the country is living with the threat of starvation, not only in Tigray, but also in the region where I'm from, Eastern Ethiopia. Historic drought right now is affecting the country, internal displacement. So, when people are starving, when people are unable to access basic security, basic essentials, it's not prime conditions for discussions of peace. This is just part of it. As an act of goodwill, I think it's important to release political prisoners. And of course, some of the actors involved still have the stigma, the label of being terrorist groups, the TPLF, the OLF, excuse me, sorry. Those outlets there. And the removal of foreign forces from Ethiopia also. So these are all the conditions that are required to have a national conversation, a national dialogue. So far in the process of creating a national commission for dialogue, there seems to be a lack of transparency. At this stage, we do have commissioners who have been chosen. And the idea, of course, was to have the Ethiopian public select these commissioners, but there's very little clarity on how they were selected. I know certainly for the Somali representative, and Somalis right now in Ethiopia have been asking themselves, exactly how was this person selected? Someone who's a veteran of Ethiopian politics, a former ambassador. So it seems very much like the status quo, not the independent people and figures that are needed for leading this dialogue. Many of the key stakeholders, of course, are missing or have said that they are boycotting. This, of course, includes the Oromo Federalist Congress, the Oromo Liberation Front, the Ogaden National Liberation Front. Many of the key actors who are opposition groups who should be at the table have already said that they won't be. So the other question, excuse me, is how can
if you could just wrap up, we'll have plenty of time for discussion.
Sure, I'll just raise one question. I'll just raise one question. Is also the question of how can a party to the conflict, in this case, I'm talking about the federal government, lead a national dialogue? Of course, as actors in the conflict, they should be there. But at this moment, it seems like very much like a top-down process in which the government is actually deciding how the dialogue will take place. So the question of transparency, inclusivity is already threatened from the outset. So I'll leave my comments at that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And your initial point about how history is so vibrant and alive in Ethiopia is really well taken. I was very struck in the controversies over the location of the celebration in Addis Ababa. Should it be in Adwa Square? But those who wanted to celebrate Adwa actually insisted on it being in Menelik Square. And I also saw there were Russian flags being waved there, which I thought was interesting. And of course, when you talk about narratives, contending narratives, whereas two parties can come together to have a compromise on an issue of power or ceasefire or territory, when it's narratives, there's no obvious compromise. have to have a space for these narratives to coexist and contend. But these are issues we can come back to. Let me ask Emabet to speak, and if you could switch on. I know your video is not working well, but if you could switch it on, even for that blurry screen, then it will help when you are speaking.
Yes, I hope we can. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just. So thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alessi, for inviting me to share my views on this timely and important topic in Ethiopia. I really appreciate also you brought the perspective from Tigray. Also, the previous speaker mentioned about what the ongoing challenges in Ethiopia, and also particularly the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Tigray. But also, I felt that my role here is also to speak about to zoom out a little bit, and then also look at the challenges that we are facing, and also we've seen the damage the war caused, not only in Tigray at the moment, but also other regions, and how this different perspectives are playing out, and also the contending, like you said, the contending narratives are playing out in the general public at all. And I think for me, yes, Ethiopia is a country where you have many fault lines, including ethnicity, identity, history, the ethnogeography, boundaries, the governance, and country, how the country is governed. There are obviously wide-ranging players, both state and non-state actors, and armed groups and non-armed groups, but also people who are really at the ground. So many movement resistance groups building up, and that is really something that I think we need to look at and focus in terms of how do we enter into the pathway of peace. And for me, how do we reimagine peace after all the damage that we've seen? I think it's really fair to say we've seen a lot of what conflict or war can do to a society, but we haven't really tried the pathway of peace. And so I know there are different political interests, and so many overlapping, but also sometimes, as it looks like, irreconcilable differences. But how do we get to the pathway from violence towards a state of peace, and which can be, in my opinion, non-linear, and very messy at times, and also could take a long-term process. Also, how do we transcend the dilemma?
Emma, but I think we're having difficulty hearing you. You're coming in and out of it. Could you speak close to the microphone?
Okay, maybe okay. Is it better?
Yes, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just saying, how do we transcend the dilemma of wars when wars end and when peace begins? I think for many people, the trauma, the recent trauma from the war is still fresh, and the agony, the grievance is still alive, and people are still grappling with how do we deal with the very big question of justice, and before we also enter into peace. And so I think these are the really big questions that we need to think about in terms of moving the country and as people as well. So in my view, there are nascent elements, components that can help us move towards that direction, looking at the pathway to peace. First, I think it's you can call it political will, but it should be political determination, which is established based on the full acknowledgement that violence is not sustainable. And here you have the thinking would be, adopting non-violence as a strategy to approach the intricate issues that we're faced. For that, you need also political leadership or commitment from all sides that believe in the incentives of peace or the dividends of peace. So this continuous, for example, mutual delegitimization that also led us to the war or to the conflict 2 years ago. I think that needs to be, the de-escalation has to start. That has to happen, in my opinion. And I think that Safia earlier mentioned about the humanitarian need on the ground, and that allowing full humanitarian access to people in need, I think especially in the conflict zone, is really important and essential at this time, because as I mentioned, many people are faced with this challenge, and the fact that we're talking about maybe dialogue could be sometimes morally wrong. So I think that's something that we need to consider. The other point is the cessation of hostilities. Yes, it's been described in many platforms, been suggested by the UN and all actors. But I think the commitment to negotiations often here is expressed by the belligerent parties to start, to change their behavior. And this is a big gesture for peace as well. And looking at, for example, the media and how the different followers of the different groups or parties express themselves both publicly and also in private spaces is very important. And I think the escalation will be seen in that regard, in my opinion. So the other point is the declaration of maybe ceasefire. I think that comes, after maybe the cessation of hostilities, with this, clear commitment to enter into negotiation and dialogue in an inclusive manner.
Sorry, Amabet, we're losing you again. Could you speak close to the microphone?
Is it fine now?
Carry on.
Just to mention also the component, I hope you heard me coherently, but the other element I wanted to highlight is the weaving the formal and informal peace initiatives that has existed or has been tried across the country. I know the space for civil society, especially in the last maybe decade, has been really compromised in many ways. So you may expect less interventions from CSOs, but there are some ongoing efforts or initiatives by different groups. So, one thing that you can talk about of weaving this formal and informal peace initiative is you're creating a simultaneous negotiating space and an interface between grassroots understanding of sustainable peace to that of an elite bargaining process. And this can be handled in a national dialogue space or setting to discuss issues including security arrangements and as maybe Mulketa talked about, the issue of referendum on, Alex, you mentioned the, faith of the ethnic federalism in Ethiopia, the justice or what kind of accountability mechanisms that we need to use. Those things will be really discussed in this kind of setting. And for me, this also aim at building a collaborative norm and capacities among different actors. And the final point would be on a shared agreement towards building a resilient and peaceful society. I mean, ideally, but this is about the agreed shared vision aimed at transforming conflicts and also relationships among different groups. And we know there is huge grievance, but still, how do we also get to that point of, transforming conflicts is a big point we need to emphasize on. I think all these points or components are underpinned by, for me, a peace building strategy. And as you know, there is no endpoint to peace building. In general, it's important to acknowledge that it will be an inherently fluid and very dynamic process with a potential diversity of strands and adapt, to emerging contextual challenges. So I think this is some of the I think way forward points that I wanted to bring. Thank you.
Thank you, Amabet, and apologies to everyone, including you, especially Amabet, for the poor connection. But I think your points were well received, and I think anyone who who is familiar with Life and Peace Institute will also recognize the themes that you are picking up on. And I might also mention that the one academic publication that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was a short piece published by Life and Peace Institute a few years ago. Let me ask Mabratu to contribute his remarks. And you are muted still, Mabratu. I need to unmute. There we are. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Alex. I'm delighted to join you and other panelists. And also, I'm very delighted to see and hear from my former professor at Addis Ababa University, Medeta, his perspective on Tigray from the ground. I would like to say a few things about the developmental state and the political marketplace. You are the experts. As many of us agree, Ethiopia's economy was growing fast under the EPRDF regime. That growth came at the expense of democracy and human rights. Yet the experiment with the developmental state undoubtedly provided relative stability, economic growth, and infrastructure development. On the flip side, by insisting on the material elements, the EPRDF regime betrayed the promise of federal democracy. Literally, Ethiopia was a highly centralized policy state under the EPRDF administration. This betrayal of the promise of democracy led to mismanagement of the federal arrangement and the economy, which is compounded by the problem of land grabbing. So these cumulative grievances contributed to the emergence of the Oromo social movement, which had suffered brutal repression by the security forces almost for 2 years, when it finally led to leadership change within the ruling coalition, propelling Abiy Ahmed to power. So basically inherited a functioning state with a growing economy, of course, minus democracy. So because of that, one of the mandates he was given when he took office as the country prime minister was to lead the country on the path of democratic transition and heal the divided nation. But he failed. He failed not only to deliver democracy, but it took him only 3 years to dismantle what was built in 30 years. So Ethiopia has now become a fragile state with the worst humanitarian crisis. According to a recent UN report, estimate over 22 million Ethiopia will require humanitarian assistance in 2022. Over 500,000 Tigrayans also live in famine-like condition. So under Abiy administration, Ethiopia follows the contemporary version of the feudal imperial state or imperial order that Professor Alex, you call it the political marketplace. There are several evidences pointing to this development in the current situation. I know Professor Alex used this concept to explain the weakness of state and institution and trade in power politics in the turbulent African states such as Somalia and Sudan, but certainly not Ethiopia. I'm sure he will not hold the same condition regarding Ethiopia under the current scenario, because Ethiopia under current scenario fulfills many criteria of political marketplace. For example, Ethiopia is one of the 3 countries that have shown the highest fragility due to the bloody civil war, whose main originator and main operator has been the prime minister himself. Basically, Abiy migrated from Nobel Peace Laureate to the architect of the world's most worst humanitarian crisis. Second, Ethiopia was one of a country that exports peace to its neighboring countries through its peacekeeping mission. But now Ethiopia itself become one of the variant of fragile states, a chaotic place where state bodies and religious leaders promote all forms of atrocities, violence, and genocidal war. Third, corruption in state resources, especially land in and around the capital, Addis Ababa, and extortion of business community has become a new normal in the name of green developments in today's Ethiopia. And fourth, loyalty to the prime minister is the only criteria for appointment. The technocrat around him can only carry out Abiy's bid unquestionably. They can hardly even express disagreements, even at internal party meetings, something that the EPRDF regime used to allow in centralized policy state. And most vividly, Abiy practices transactional leadership style. As we all know, Abiy came to power with the promise of advancing democratization and bridging division among the ethnic groups through peaceful dialogue. But instead of becoming a transformational leader, he operated as a transactional leader, competing for short-term political gain by shifting his loyalty between the Amara and Oromo blocks. His initial approach was to rally the Oromo to his side until he was given the post of prime ministership. Later, he abandoned them and sided with the Amara political elite. Now, after inflicting so many atrocities and bloodshed, he is tempering to shift his allegiance once again. This is vividly visible from his recent parliamentary speech. He literally presenting himself as the Messiah of peace, defender of the right of the Tigray mothers and children. But this sudden turnaround and self-promotion of himself as the Messiah of peace is not coming with the sincere desire to silence the gun or hold an inclusive national dialogue to solve the country's crisis. There are other motives behind this sudden change. One, he seeks to use the rhetoric of the national dialogue to pacify his international audiences that are pressing him, his governments, and treating him with sanctions. Second, he planned to use the national dialogue platform to his own advantage as a short-term crisis management mechanism to prolong the life of his regime. The ruling Prosperity Party is said to have already finalized the drafting of a new constitution that will redefine the regional boundaries and identities. And I think he is seeking to embark on his unilaterally designed political program using the national dialogue as a cover. I stop my remark here and come back to it maybe later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabrato. And I think you raised some really important issues, not only about the past, but also about the present, about whether the model, the developmental federal model of EPRDF, whether it was intrinsically flawed or whether the model itself was abused by those in power, making promises that it failed, it could have delivered on, but failed to deliver. And then also the nature of this transition. And as you say, I mean, it gives me no pleasure to recognize that Ethiopia is becoming a political marketplace, not only internally, but also in relation to its the wider region, the way that it is that it has become dependent upon the flows of money and weapons and the and exchange of favors with, particularly with Abu Dhabi, but also other players in the Middle East. And so part of that broader, Middle Eastern security perimeter, and we've seen how those Gulf states conduct their politics and their international relations. For Ethiopia to be sucked into that is disturbing. Anyway, last of our panelists is Gautam. So please, your remark.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'd like to say a few words about the national dialogue, a critical take on the national dialogue, and I'll be echoing some of the points made by my colleagues. So I think it's important to focus on the national dialogue because of the faith that has been put into it as a solution for Ethiopia's political crisis, notably by the international community, but also to some extent a lot of Ethiopian elites who have taken it seriously enough to analyze it and criticizing it. Some of the points that have been raised is the exclusive nature of the process and the fact that it's excluding notably armed groups such as TDF and OLF and other groups that the ruling party does not get along with. But actually, I think it's not just a process, the procedure that's problematic, but the very exercise itself, I think is problematic. And my answer or my argument in relation to that, to some extent, reflects my diagnosis of Ethiopia's current problems. I think, I would argue that there are primarily three sort of categories of actors involved in Ethiopia's conflict today. On the one hand, you have the ethno-national opposition groups who want an end to repression, political exclusion. They want power, essentially, and they want to implement the current constitution and restart the reform process that was started in 2018, but has since derailed. The second category is unitary nationalist groups whom are either part of the government or somewhat sympathetic to the government, and their primary goal is a change of the constitution to change its federal characteristics. And thirdly, you have the ruling party, whose priority, I think, at this point in time, is to maintain its grip on power. Excuse me. So I think essentially Ethiopia's, the two things that we disagree on are the extent to which power should be shared, whether there should be some sort of power sharing arrangement, and our differences on nationalism. Now the national dialogue process is set up as a deliberative process. And I think that implies that there will be an exchange of ideas, perspectives, and that is in turn assumed to reduce polarization and conflict. That is the rationale of the dialogue, as I understand it. Putting aside the criticism that has been put forward about the biased nature of the commission and the fact that it might be directly controlled by the government, even if it was a legitimate entity, I think it would be unlikely to solve Ethiopia's main problems. If you look at the problem of competing nationalisms, it's not simply a matter of ideology, but it's also a matter of identity. So I cannot imagine how we, through deliberation, can sort of come to an understanding that doesn't involve compromising our identities. And in that regard, I think a one-off deliberative process is going to be, it's not going to be sufficient to temper even the problem of competing nationalisms. Perhaps a process over many years could lead to some moderation of our positions, but a one-off process is unlikely to lead to that. And then there's the other issue of repression and autocracy, and that is also unlikely to be solved because it's a deliberate instrument used by the regime to stay in power. So the key grievances are unlikely to be solved through this process. But whilst it doesn't solve the main issues, I think, or main problems, it does have certain functions. One function is that it provides, it's a smokescreen for the government to give the impression that some progress is being made. Secondly, it provides an opportunity to buy time to consolidate regime power. And thirdly, it provides the international community with an agenda that allows them to say that they're doing something to solve the problem, right? So if you noticed, a lot of foreign diplomats and leaders, whenever they talk about Ethiopia today, they simply relegate the issue to the national dialogue process and say that we expect the national dialogue to be inclusive and solve the problem. So I think if there's a genuine intention to find a solution, we need to go back to what happened in 2018 and ask why the reform was needed. We need a democratic reform because 4 years of protest had brought the state to a standstill, right? And what the EPRDF concluded was that exclusive autocracy had run its course in Ethiopia. It's simply not feasible. It's not a matter of it being unethical. That's not the only issue. It's also impossible to do that in Ethiopia now and get away with it. And so I think any serious effort to reverse Ethiopia's trajectory must aim towards democratic reform and try to avoid anything that can lead to autocratic consolidation. Which brings me to the core problem with being the Prosperity Party's total control of power. And without addressing that issue, I don't think it's going to be possible to make any progress. So I think the type of format that's needed is not a dialogue, a local dialogue, but an international mediation. One that can provide neutral mediation and that could be inclusive with a proper rules of engagement and a plan for implementing a democratic transition of some sort. Finally, I would like to say that by entertaining these deceptive ploys of the government and simply regurgitating them, I think the international community is contributing to the unraveling of the Ethiopian state. And I don't think that they should expect the current trajectory to change by sort of playing into the government's hands. So, looking at Ethiopia the last 5-6 years, there's been a continual trajectory in one direction, economically, politically, security-wise. And if we look at, throughout those 6 years, there's been always this, there's always been an initiative like the current national dialogue, which has simply been a deceptive tool to continue with the current autocratic system. I think I'll stop there and happy to discuss in the discussion section.
Thank you very much, Goitem. I can't help noticing that when a number of the key international interlocutors talk about national dialogue, it's almost as though they want to forget about the last 3 years and basically say that was all a bad dream. Let us go back to Abiy and your genuine reform agenda. And of course, a lot has happened a huge amount has happened in the last 3 years that cannot be overlooked. And what would have been perhaps an instrument at that time 3 years ago to address the democratic deficits may no longer be appropriate. Which actually brings me on to two questions that have been posted. By the way, please use the Q&A, not the chat, to post your questions. And the two questions relate to justice. One is from Barakat Diraba, which is specifically for Safia, but others may want to respond too. What do you think is the role of memory of past injustices in the current ongoing political chaos in Ethiopia? How do you think it should be addressed? So I'm guessing past injustices is not just the last 3 years, but going back more deeply. But I'll bring another justice question in as well, and perhaps you could answer them together. From Jalila and Bae, which is, although peace seems to be of immediate necessity in Tigray and the entire region, the question of justice and accountability, justice and reconciliation also arises. Which mechanisms can be used to enable transformation beyond transition, while searching for peace simultaneously? Do they have to be grounded in local structures, or is a top-down intervention needed? Especially having the viability future of a coherent Ethiopian state with its imperial and colonial history in mind. So I think that that also addresses your points, Safia. So let me ask you to respond to those, but then I'll give the opportunity to others.
Sure. I'll take them together, and I'll start actually with the second question about, also thinking about what type of mechanisms are needed, whether they have to be grounded in local structures or top down. So I think, of course, any successful effort at redress must require local structures. And Ethiopia is not the only country to experience kind of histories of human rights violations, conflict, civil war. Certainly there are models that can be taken from other countries, whether that's in Africa, whether that's in Latin America, to think about what transitional justice might look like. But certainly there's room for Ethiopians themselves to decide what that might look like. I think key is trust here. Whether that'll need, an external kind of international involvement aspect to this, because there's a fundamental mistrust of many marginalized groups, really Ethiopians in general, for Ethiopian state institutions. So establishing trust and having a process that does have an aspect of trust and does involve, it does have an inclusive aspect to it is critical. To get to the question and to bring this together, the question about how memory also affects past injustice. I think memory, historical memory, is at the core of collective identities in Ethiopia. Really, if you just kind of really get down to it, this is fundamentally, these identities are forged around historical memory, historical experience, shared experience, regional experience. So history is at the core of this. And certainly this animates the conflict as well, because people are bringing in not only historical grievance, and this includes also more aggressive parties talking about, 27 years of injustice, kind of being what legitimates the war in Tigray. So there are many different types of grievances here. So I do think there needs to be some form, some mechanism, some form of transitional justice. Again, we can look at this internationally, here in Canada, we've had truth and reconciliation committees. South Africa has done the same. And then, also, what does that look like? Can this be in the form of institutional reforms, which I think are critical, right? Again, the distrust for institutions in Ethiopia require some level of reform, or even just completely changing really the nature of the state as we know it. Would it look like perhaps some sort of reparations or investments? Taking Tigray for an example, the war, will lead to perhaps decades of reconstruction efforts, right? This has damaged this region for years to come. And that'll require, as part of this process of healing and reconciliation, will require reinvestment to kind of get Tigray back on its feet. This is also true if you look at this in a longer perspective, right? There's a correlation between historical marginalization and actual economic and political marginalization in Ethiopia. My region, the Somali region of Ethiopia, is considered to be an emerging region, one of the most underdeveloped, very little infrastructure until recent years, no high school until the 2000s, outside of Jigjiga. So this is really regions that need significant input, significant reinvestment. And this, again, is part of that transitional justice model, this idea of reparation, of reinvestment. And then whether Ethiopians would also like to see judicial redress, I think, is also something to think about. Certainly certain actors, I think for many people, part of that healing process would require some aspect of justice there. And again, this begs the question, and this is, I think, for all of us to think about, is, looking at the Prosperity Party leading this process of national dialogue, Abiy Ahmed still in the prime minister seat. Does it make sense to move forward in that way? Or, as part of a good faith move towards reconciliation, would that require the removal of him as a prime minister? I think is something for us to think about. So I'll leave it at that. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Emma Bett, this question is really also up your street with your area of expertise.
Yes. Thanks, Alex. Listen to Safia.
Can you come closer to the microphone, please?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, I was also thinking about the presentation by Goitom, and I think the points that he was alluding to about, obviously the questioning the national dialogue might be okay, but also, have to come to reality or to terms with, it's very difficult sometimes to de-link ourselves from recent violent past to a new democratic reform or transition. So sometimes it may not be realistic, and that's why I was saying when it comes to discussing peace, you need to also have this thinking around whether the system that is in place allows that kind of condition, discussion. But I think what I was going to raise is and the national dialogue. I think at least we need to give it the benefit of the doubt and see whether that's a path that we didn't try. That's the point that I was going to make. So it's not going to be purely a clean slate, but it should be something that we could try and at least if it's an inclusive process, including, like I said, bringing grassroots voices and bottom-up process and trying a lot of parallel processes or simultaneous processes that could include different views. I think it might also change the way in which we look at or we relate to the state, or we can come up with the state or social contract. But in terms of also looking at the past.
Sorry, we are losing you again.
Oh, okay. Is it okay now?
Yes, please stay close to the microphone.
Yes. Yeah. So I was just, the whole point I was making was not for us not to limit ourselves to the idea that we can't have a dialogue, we can't have a discussion unless the current status quo changes. I think that needs a little bit of investigation from all sides, but also a deeper analysis of the situation on the ground and the reality on the ground, and where the power lies and how we are relating to power. But also, I think looking at the national dialogue, one of the important elements is to bring voices that are marginalized, but also looking at the different realities and lived experiences of different people and groups and across the country. And looking at the peace and justice kind of dilemma, I think we, in the past, there has been special courts, especially post-Derg prosecutors, special prosecutors. There was a trial for their officials, and mostly it was retributive kind of justice. It wasn't mainly on restorative justice that really looks at a comprehensive way of responding to justice. So in a way, what we need at the moment is also for collective healing, and that looks at reparations, restorative elements of justice, and that kind of transitional justice needs to be in place for people to have the redress that they need. And I think we need to be open for this whole idea, and I think that coexistence, but also this social cohesion need to be considered and to be thought.
Okay, thank you. Mabratu, Goitom, do either of you want to come in on this question? Okay. Let me move on to a couple more. There is one question which actually came on the chat from Mengistu Jaber, who then also put a question, which is about, he considers our conversation very biased, and I want to know how the panelists are picked. I wanted to point out that we had one of the problems with having civil discussions and exchanges of views on Ethiopia is that in the past, and including panels convened by the LSE, in the past, when we've had people who represent a federal government point of view, or the point of view of what one might call the Amhara ethno-nationalists. They refuse to engage in discussion. They simply deny the facts and blame everything on the other side and prevent us having the kind of constructive discussion we've had today, which is why this panel was chosen in the way that it was. That said, I want to actually pose this as a problem, because there is a constituency, that passionately believes in the ethno-national project of rolling back what they see as the great historic era of 1991. The language around genocide here is interesting, because most of us, when we think of genocide, we think of the scale of crime that is committed, and this is what Mulugeta was referring to in his opening discussion. But some people, when they talk about genocide, and here one could think of both Vladimir Putin and some of the sort of representatives who label themselves as Ethiopian unitarists. For them, an offense against the nation, the group, is something that is mystical, that is transcendental, and is greater than the individuals that comprise it. And therefore, to challenge its role in history, its role in politics, and to offend it, and also to commit crimes against its members, therefore is ipso facto genocidal. And we often see this argument coming out, and really it is a challenge. This seems to me to be a very fundamental challenge for national dialogue, and this comes really back to Safia, your opening point. In many parts of the world, people have got over imperialism. Clearly they haven't in Russia, clearly they haven't in Ethiopia. How do we engage with those who have that other point of view, and who have also legitimate grievances about the way that they have been treated? Safia, you want to speak first?
Yeah, sure. So it's something that I find very troubling, actually, and I think we can call kind of this rise of that very ethno-nationalist language, as you mentioned, perhaps an Ethiopian right. I think it tracks with much of what we're seeing across the globe. India is something that I think about a lot in terms of kind of a Hindu nationalist right. I think Ethiopia is seeing a similar development of a sort of radicalized right-wing ethno-nationalist right. And so I think, when we're thinking in terms of democracy, and I think I'd like to hear from others on this also, is that, to what extent can you concede to voices like that, extreme voices, which are really interested in the continued marginalization of the vast majority of Ethiopians in this case, who are very set on what it is, what exactly an Ethiopian is, what it means to be an Ethiopian, what Ethiopian history is. And these are very exclusionary. So I think in a democratic state, of course, you will see parties, for instance, that represent that right. But the question is, should the state be formed and organized around that type of extremist right? And I think the answer is no. And in fact, I think it should be, any democratic state should shield kind of marginalized groups. And in this case, it's really the majority of Ethiopians that we're talking about from the potential violence of an extremist right. I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's something that I find quite troubling, where the discourse is so polarized, where you will see people who, I've seen a lot of also internet harassment and, the calls for events like this to be canceled. I'm sure LSE received emails. So there's also kind of an element of trolling, an element of propaganda, and it's highly organized as well. In Canada, we've seen panels canceled because of pressure, very organized pressure campaigns. And I think it tracks with a lot of right-wing activity globally. And I do think it's important to think of it in those terms.
Yeah, and ironically, they are trying to position themselves as anti-imperialists, which is like actually a characteristic thing coming out of Hindu nationalism in India. But Mebratu, maybe you want to come in on this point, because the position that you are taking is a very interesting one vis-a-vis the recent history of Ethiopia.
Let me say a few words. With regard to the historical memory, I think one thing we should know is if Ethiopia to come to term with its past and successfully turn its attention to the future, it is very essential that the truth of the past must be officially established, because there are disagreements over the historical narratives and historical figures and symbols between different national groups of the country. And this process also must be complemented by the transitional justice mechanism to work through the collective traumas. This should be the foundation of the peace process. It should not, the justice should be the foundation of the peace process. And criminal must not be allowed to work free in the name of reconciliation or in the name of national dialogue. So for this to happen, cessation of hostility is, as the other panelists said, cessation of hostility should be an urgent task, because there cannot be peace or dialogue with the gun at the head of the citizen. But we should not be under illusion that the crisis facing the country can be resolved with the cessation of hostility alone. There should be a genuine and all-inclusive dialogue to deliberate on the fundamental controversial issues that causing frequent conflict in the country. So the current conflict in Ethiopia is not just a conflict over power. It is deeper than that, as has been raised by the panelists. It's deeper than that. It's a chronicle and a systemic national crisis that has been haunting the country for decades. So the root cause, as Safia was saying, the root cause, the essence of the current crisis was and still is a conflict and dispute over the building, how to build the modern Ethiopian state. That means the war in Tigray, or the conflict is, in different parts of Ethiopia, is a war of vision over the future of the country. Abiy tried to pursue a failed nation building project, which is centralizing, which is unitary state model. On the flip side, the rebels and many political forces want to defend the current ethnic federalism, the current political arrangements, or they seek to expand the scope of the regional autonomy. Even some want to opt for a confederal arrangement or secessions. So such contradictory and very polarized political stances can only be resolved through a peaceful national dialogue that does not exclude anyone. So for this to happen, the first thing need to be done is normalizing the ordinary daily life of the Ethiopians, especially the Tigrayans, is necessary. Restoring the basic services such as the electricity, telecommunication, banking service, all these things are very important. They serve as confidence building measures and help, especially the humanitarian efforts. And one point need to be really emphasized with that is the reintegration of the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army back into the transition process is very critical for the success of the peace process of the national dialogue. In the first place, it was the dismemberment of this group and other key stakeholders from the transition process, that become the reason for the current for the tension between the federal government and the regional states, which eventually escalated into a civil war. So we need to reintegrate them back into the transition process. This is a very essential thing, I think. So there is one point I really want to make in relation to their integration back into the transition process. The government, the Abiy administration, and those who allied with Abiy, especially the Amara political elites, they see the reintegration or the negotiation with TPLF or with the Oromo Liberation Army as a counterproductive for the peace process or for the national dialogue. In fact, these groups see the political program or the political question and demand advocated by the TPLF or by the Oromo Liberation Army not as a genuine political question. They see them as something mental health problem. You can see that such kind of rhetoric from those people who advocate the unitary state model. So now, for example, in one of the recent publication, Dawit Wadagiorgis published, he on the national dialogue, he suggested that the commission member should include psychiatrists, because he see that the problem, the question which are raised by ethno-federalists is not only a political question, it's not a political question, but it's a mental health problem. It seems to some extent, Abiy might have bought this idea when he appointed the commissioner, the commissioner of the regional, the national dialogue, Masfun Area, is a psychiatrist. I don't know whether it is a coincidence or what. So, yeah.
On that point, Mabrato, I'm going to ask you to stop because we're running short on time, and I want to give Gautam, who's been waiting patiently, also a chance to say a few words. I would just add one point, which is that people must not forget that you make peace with your enemies, you don't make peace with your friends. Gautam.
Thank you, Alex. When some of the questions were raised, I came to think about something that has been irking me for quite some time, actually. There seems to be almost consistent reluctance to acknowledge the deep problem that Ethiopia is facing as a society. Ethiopia today is a society, as we speak, that is starving 6 million people and has been doing so for more than a year. And what's fascinating is not that they're doing it in the 21st century, it's the nonchalant attitude with which they're killing 6 million people. That's a very profound situation, if you ask me. That says something really disturbing about this society. And that is, the intention here is not to point fingers and blame particular groups, but that tells you that this society is not only divided, it's a broken society. There's something fundamentally problematic here, it's as problematic as it can get, essentially. We're killing a section of society and it's not even a big deal. Academics, intellectuals are supporting this policy of starving millions of people to death in public by writing academic opinion pieces, right? So, acknowledging the depth of Ethiopia's problems means, for example, that a simple national dialogue is not going to solve our problem. We're not just going to sit and somehow get over that deep-rooted hate. So I think it's important to acknowledge what Ethiopia exactly is. It is important to sit down and have an honest discussion amongst ourselves and with ourselves, and ask, what is leading us to be so cruel to each other? And once we've sort of established that, once you've had a real thorough thinking through that question, I think it's important to ask the question: what implication does this have for creating a functional democratic state in Ethiopia? Is that even feasible? And are we so are we as a society functional enough, for example, to manage a transitional process on our own? I think not. If we look at history, every single incumbent has, without a doubt, without any hesitation, taken advantage of their power to eliminate their opponents. And that's really the modus operandi, that's the cultural sort of psychology that drives the elite. So I think at the moment, the biggest threat Ethiopia is facing is this tendency, particularly by the elite in Addis Ababa, but also the international community, to underestimate just how broken Ethiopia is as a society. I'll stop there.
Thank you, and that's a rather dismal note on which to end your contribution. There's one question that came in early from Benjamin Petrini, which was the question: what are the main international and regional actors that are playing a role in mediating the conflict, and what leverage and effects are they having? And we don't actually have time to answer that, but I'm going to just make one comment as moderator on that, which picks up on your point, Gautam, about the starvation that is being inflicted on the people of Tigray. And in addition, I would add that the developing humanitarian crisis throughout the country due to food price inflation, mass displacement and disruption, and in the south of the country due to drought. Now, a month ago, the African Union convened for its biannual summit in Addis Ababa. And the African Union is the organization that is supposedly mediating this. And the theme of the African Union Summit and the African Union year for 2022 is nutrition. And not a single one of the heads of state or speakers on the topic of nutrition mentioned any of the facts that we have just been discussing about. It was as though Ethiopia was planting trees, encouraging better nutrition amongst its people, and the continent was indeed as a whole. It was conducted in, let us say, fantasy land, and that is the organization that has been asked to mediate in this conflict. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm afraid the concluding points of our discussion have not been very optimistic, but it has been, I think, a very interesting and insightful discussion. And it just remains for me to thank the organizers, the Firoz Lalji Center, and each of our panelists, Safia Aidid, Emabet Getachew, Mebratu Kalecha, and Gautam Gebreluel. And thank you all of those who joined online. And I believe the proceedings are going to also be made available through the Firoz Lalji Center, so that any one of you can send it on to your friends who are not able to watch today. Thank you very much.